The rain began before sunset, thin and needling, like 1,000 whispered curses drifting from the city beyond the prison walls. In the stone belly of the conciergerie, where light rarely lingered and hope suffocated faster than breath, Marie Antoinette sat awake long after the guards had made their final rounds. The former Queen of France, once draped in silks, once radiant beneath chandeliers that blazed like captured stars, was now a gaunt silhouette huddled beneath a coarse gray blanket. Every shiver seemed to echo through the cramped cell, as though the walls themselves recoiled from her. It was October 15th, 1793, her last night alive. Marie's fingers, pale and trembling, traced the frayed threads at the blanket's edge. It was no use trying to sleep. The verdict had been delivered that afternoon, la guillotine, at dawn. The speed of the trial, the venom of the accusations, the jeering in the courtroom, it was all still spiraling in her mind, too vivid to dismiss, too cruel to forget. She had known the end was close, but the certainty still landed like a blade through her chest. The silence in the cell was broken only by the uneven drip of water leaking from the ceiling. She raised her head every so often, as though expecting someone to appear, a guard, a priest, the ghost of someone she once loved. But the only companions she had were shadows and the tightening cold. Then footsteps, slow, steady, metallic. Marie straightened, swallowing hard. For an instant she imagined the footsteps belonged to her husband, Louis, with his gentle, resigned smile, but reality returned swiftly and without mercy. Louis XVI had been executed months earlier, and she had heard the roar of the crowd even from behind palace walls. That memory alone made her grip the blanket closer. A guard stopped outside her cell. The iron door creaked open, spilling a sliver of lantern light across the floor. "Your confessor," the guard muttered, stepping aside. A small, thin priest entered, Abbé Magnian, the only clergyman the tribunal permitted to see her. His expression carried both sorrow and fear, as though even comforting her were an act punishable by death. "Your Majesty," he whispered, bowing his head. The title struck her like a faint, forgotten melody, so rare, so distant, yet unbearably familiar. Marie blinked, steadying her breath. "I am no longer that," she replied softly. "To me you are," he said. His sincerity nearly undid her. For a moment, she felt the sting of tears gathering, but she pushed them back. She had shed enough tears, too many to count, over the fate of France, over her children torn from her, over the long decay of her marriage and crown that had grown heavier with each passing year. "Sit," she said gently. "I need no comfort but the truth." The priest nodded and knelt beside her pallet. "They have set dawn for the execution. I will accompany you as far as they allow." Marie exhaled slowly. The knowledge was not new, yet hearing it spoken aloud carved a deeper wound. Dawn. Only hours left. "What of my son?" she asked, voice thin. "My poor Louis Charles. Do they still keep him locked away?" The priest hesitated, and that hesitation was enough. Marie closed her eyes. The cruelty of her enemies reached far beyond politics. It stretched into the hearts of her children. Her daughter, Marie Therese, had been taken as well, though at least the girl was still alive. As for the boy, her only surviving son, she feared the world he faced, a world built on revenge and blood. "Pray for him," she whispered. "Pray that he survives this nightmare." "I do," the priest answered. "Every day." A long pause settled between them, filled with the soft tremor of the lantern flame. Marie shifted slightly, tucking the blanket higher around her shoulders. "I thought I would die in Versailles," she said, almost laughing at the absurdity. "Surrounded by tapestries, courtiers, music, not here. God chooses our trials," Abbé Magnian murmured. "Or men do," she countered quietly. "And God watches." He did not argue. Instead, he offered his hand, and she took it, a small lifeline in a sea of dread. They prayed. The words came haltingly at first, then steadier, anchored by the rhythm of faith she had clung to in childhood. Marie felt herself drift somewhere between memory and present, drifting like a leaf on cold water. She remembered the gardens of Schönbrunn, her mother's stern face, the laughter of her siblings. She remembered Louis's shy smile when they first met as children nearly forced into adults' roles. She remembered her daughter's tiny hands clasped around her own, her son's curls brushing her chin. The memories brightened her heart even as they broke it. When the prayers ended, Abbé Magnian placed a small wooden crucifix in her palm. Its edges were worn, familiar, gentle. "I must go," he said. "The guard will return soon." Marie nodded faintly. "Thank you." He bowed again and slipped from the cell. The door shut behind him with a sharp, final click. Marie held the crucifix tightly until her knuckles whitened. Exhaustion crept in at last, but sleep still would not come. Instead, she stared into the darkness, listening to her own breath, steadying her thoughts. It was then she heard another noise, a whisper, soft and trembling, floating just beyond the bars. Madam, are you awake?" Marie turned sharply. Through the gloom, she saw a young guard, barely older than her eldest daughter, standing close to the cell, gripping the bars as though afraid the stone walls might swallow him. His face was pale, his eyes too bright, filled with conflict. "I shouldn't speak to you," he whispered, voice shaking. "But I cannot bear what they will do in the morning." Marie's chest tightened. It struck her how human he looked, how terrified. Not every man in the city lusted for blood. "What is your name?" she asked softly. "Etienne," he whispered. "You are troubled." His breath trembled. "They spit when they say your name, as though killing you will undo every misery of France. But he closed his eyes briefly. "I have watched you here for weeks. I do not believe you are the monster they claim." Marie's throat constricted. "France suffers," she answered. "But I did not wish for this suffering. Not for my people. Not for myself." She paused. "Forgive them, Etienne, even if they cannot forgive me." Emotion flickered across his face. Shame, sorrow, helplessness. "I wish," he said softly, "that this could end differently." "So do I," she murmured. He hesitated a moment longer, then stepped back. "I will pray for you." Marie managed a faint, weary smile. "Then we are both praying." When he vanished into the corridor, silence reclaimed the cell once more. Hours crept by. The rain stopped. Just before dawn's first pale breath crept across the Seine, Marie Antoinette stood and smoothed the front of her worn dress. She straightened her posture as she had been taught since childhood, gathering dignity from the simple act. When the guards returned to escort her to her fate, she did not flinch. She lifted her chin. The heavy door opened. The last night was over. Darkness would give way to light, and to the blade that waited within it. The morning air cut like broken glass. The guards marched Marie Antoinette from the conciergerie courtyard toward the waiting cart, their boots striking sharply against the cobblestones. The sky was still a muted gray, heavy with unshed rain. It seemed Paris itself was holding its breath, bracing for another spectacle of blood. Dawn had not yet burned to the darkness. The world hung in a limbo where time felt thin, brittle, uncertain. Marie stepped into the open with a composure that surprised even her. After the suffocating gloom of her cell, the air, cold and raw as it was, felt strangely liberating. She inhaled deeply, the smell of wet stone, the murmur of distant crowds gathering like a storm, the faint metallic scent of the guillotine's blade she could not yet see but already sensed. The cart stood waiting, crude wooden, a vehicle of disgrace for all condemned by the tribunal. For others, it had been a place of horror. For her, It would be her throne of judgment, humble, low, and unbearably final. A guard gestured for her to climb aboard. Marie gathered her tattered dress, stepped up, and sat on the worn plank. The priest, Abbé Magnian, was not allowed to ride with her. That privilege had been cruelly denied. Instead, he stood among the guards, whispering prayers under his breath, his eyes glistening with helpless sorrow. When the driver lifted the reins, the cart jerked forward, and thus began the Queen's final procession. Paris awoke as the cart rattled through its narrow streets, each wheel creaking like a lament. The city was different now, its heart poisoned by hunger, anger, and fear. Houses that once displayed royal banners now hung red flags of the Revolution. Shuttered windows creaked open as citizens leaned out for a glimpse of the infamous prisoner. A chorus of jeers rose quickly. There she is, Madame Deficit, murderess. Women hurled insults with the same passion they once used to cheer her gowns. Men spat as though ridding themselves of years of resentment. Children, too young to understand anything but the hatred they had absorbed, shrieked and threw pebbles. Marie kept her gaze forward, not because she was defiant, but because if she met their eyes, she feared she might see only the specter of every mistake she had made, every rumor she had failed to quash, every ounce of fear she had inspired without meaning to. She had tried once to win their love. She had failed spectacularly. Still, not every face in the crowd held malice. A few were silent. A few were fearful. A few were even sympathetic, their expressions wavering with doubt. But none dared speak in her favor. Mercy had become a dangerous allegiance. As the cart turned into a wider avenue, the crowd thickened. Soldiers pushed back citizens eager for a closer look. Shouts blended into an ugly roar, and Marie felt each word slash at her like a whip. Look at her now. No jewels. No power. She starved us while she feasted. Let her head roll. Marie closed her eyes briefly. The voices rolled over her like a tide. She let it happen. She did not fight the wave. She let it pass through her, over her, around her. And in that surrender, she found an odd clarity. She had made errors, grave ones. Errors born not of cruelty, but of blindness, pride, and isolation. She had lived in a world wrapped in silk and ceremony, while France bled beneath it. Ignorance may not have been intentional, but it was a failing nonetheless, and she was paying for it. As the cart approached the Rue Saint-Honoré, a sudden commotion erupted near the front of the crowd. A woman burst forward, breaking through the wall of soldiers. Her voice cracked as she screamed, "Let me see her! Let me see the Austrian whore!" The soldiers grabbed the woman, but she lunged again, shaking with fury. Marie, startled by the violence, turned her gaze toward her. The woman froze as though struck. For a strange, fragile moment, their eyes locked. What the woman saw was not what she expected. Not a monster, not a tyrant, just a trembling, exhausted woman with shadows under her eyes and grief carved into the lines of her face. The woman's expression faltered. Her rage stuttered. Something, regret, confusion, humanity, flashed through her before she was pulled away. Marie exhaled slowly. A small, fleeting victory of perception. The truth, she thought, survived even in glimpses. The cart rolled on. As they neared the Place de la Revolution, the great square opened like a yawning mouth. The air shifted, a heavy, pulsing anticipation hanging above the sea of bodies. The guillotine stood tall at the center, its blade glinting faintly, hungry for its next sacrifice. Crowds pressed shoulder to shoulder around the scaffold. Hawkers sold pamphlets. Children perched on their parents' shoulders. The scene was disturbingly festive, as though a holiday had dawned. Marie felt her pulse quicken, but not from fear. It was something deeper, a sudden awareness that every step from here on carried meaning. Her last impressions, her last gestures, her last words would echo, perhaps not enough to redeem her, but perhaps enough to reveal her truth. When the cart halted, the executioner, Henri Sanson, approached. He removed his hat respectfully, a small gesture of dignity he had extended even to kings. "Madam," he said quietly, "I will help you descend." Marie nodded. As she stepped down, her foot caught on a stone, sending her stumbling. She reached out instinctively, and her hand brushed the executioner's boot. She froze. Then, in a voice steady but mortal, she whispered, "Pardon me, sir. I did not mean to do it." Some claim those were her final words, a moment of grace amid the brutality. But in reality, they were simply human words. Words of politeness, habit, humility. Words that reflected not the queen she was, but the fragile woman she had become. Sanson guided her toward the steps. The crowd roared. Drums thundered. The blade loomed above her like a promise. Marie steadied herself and lifted her chin. Her pale face glowed faintly in the morning light, not with royalty, not with pride, with acceptance. She climbed the scaffold. As the drums grew louder, she wondered whether anyone would remember her differently, whether history would ever understand the woman beneath the crown. And as she reached the top, she realized something with startling clarity. This was no longer about vengeance or politics or power. This was the moment France demanded a symbol, and she, broken, worn mortal, would be that symbol. Her final breath of freedom trembled in the cold air as the crowd roared for blood. The blade waited. For a moment, the world above the scaffold fell eerily still. The drums, though pounding, seemed distant. The shouts blurred into an indistinguishable roar. Time stretched thin, trembling like a fragile thread ready to snap. Marie Antoinette stood beneath the shadow of the guillotine's frame, not as a queen, nor even a prisoner, but simply as a woman, exhausted, trembling, and profoundly mortal. Sanson gestured toward the plank where she would be bound. His eyes, though hardened by duty, flickered with something like pity. He had executed nobles, traitors, paupers, thieves. Yet the presence of the former queen carried a weight unlike any other, not because she was special, but because France had made her into something more than flesh and blood, a symbol, a target, a vessel for anger that had been brewing for centuries. The crowd quieted as she approached the lunette. Marie's steps were steady, but inside her heart shook. Let it be quick. Let it be merciful. Let my children someday forgive me. She knelt. Her fingers brushed the rough wood, splintered, stained, still warm from previous victims. She closed her eyes. Abbe Magni, and began murmuring a prayer from the edge of the scaffold. Barely audible above the buzz of tension, Marie whispered her own final plea, not to be spared, not to be remembered, but simply, may they find peace. It was unclear whether she meant her children, the people of France, or all those who had suffered under the throne she once adorned. Perhaps she meant all of them. The executioner moved efficiently. He tied her hands. The rope scratched her wrists. He lifted her hair, now streaked with gray and matted from imprisonment, and tucked it into the cloth to prevent it from interfering with the blade. Her neck touched the cold groove. Her breath stuttered. The lunette closed. And suddenly, the world sharpened into exquisite clarity. She felt everything. The heat of her own breath, the sting of wind against her cheeks, the weight of the crucifix, still clutched between her fingers, the faint tremor of the wooden platform under the shifting feet of Sanson's assistants. Memory surged through her like a flood. The golden corridors of Versailles, the candlelit laughter of masquerade balls, the tiny hand of her daughter in hers, the whispered giggles of her son as she read him stories, Louis's gentle nod when he first learned they would have an heir, The desperate crowds outside the palace gates. The truth she had learned too late, that a queen without her people is nothing, and a people without compassion are lost. The blade hissed above her, sliding into position. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Sanson pulled the lever. The blade descended. A flash, cold, violent, absolute. And then silence. A silence so profound it seemed to swallow the city. Even the crowd paused, struck by the brutality of the moment they had begged for. Even the most fervent revolutionaries felt a strange emptiness as her body fell into the basket. One woman fainted. A man wiped his face, uncertain if the wetness on his cheek was rain or something else. But the silence did not last. A roar exploded through the square. Cheers, shouts, laughter, sobs. A chaotic symphony of triumph and horror. The people of Paris surged forward as though they craved proximity to the final evidence of their victory. Sanson lifted the severed head. It was customary, mandatory, but even he felt his hand tremble. The queen's face, once framed by diamonds and silk, now stared blankly, her features frozen not in terror, but in a strange softness. A faint crease of mourning lingered around her brow, as though her final emotion had been sorrow, not fear. Someone shouted, "Long live the Republic!" The crowd echoed it, though not with unity, only with noise, because beneath their cries lay something they could not name, a recoil, a chill, the shocked recognition that they had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. Far from the scaffold, in alleys and doorways where the poor huddled against the cold, whispers traveled quickly. They killed her. A queen guillotined. Will it bring bread? Will it bring peace? Old men shook their heads. Mothers clutched their children a little tighter. Soldiers exhaled, unsure whether to feel victorious or sickened. Revolutionaries who had painted her as a monster now found themselves searching the depths of their own hearts, and were unsettled by what they found. Not remorse exactly, but a lingering sense of unease that perhaps the violence had begun to devour its own purpose. At the Café de Foy, where debates once sparked a fire of rebellion, the atmosphere was tense. A handful of young men shouted jubilantly about justice served, waving newspapers and pamphlets. But others, older, quieter, sat with their hands wrapped around mugs of bitter coffee, staring into the steam as though looking for answers that refused to come. One whispered, "If even the queen can be killed, who among us is safe now?" No one replied. Outside, the rain finally began to fall, light at first, then harder, washing the blood from the scaffold, sweeping it into the gutters. Paris drank it greedily, unaware of how much more blood it would soon demand. Etienne, the young guard who had spoken to her the night before, lingered near the edge of the square long after the crowds had begun to disperse. He had not watched the execution. He couldn't. He had turned away, staring at the stone buildings instead, counting his breaths as though he might drown otherwise. But he heard the blade fall. He heard the crowd erupt. And when he finally dared look, it was already over. Her body was being taken away, her head lowered, the scaffold soaked, the people celebratory. Etienne felt something crack inside him. He sank to a bench in a nearby alley, pressed his hands to his face, and tried, unsuccessfully, not to cry. He had been raised to believe justice was sacred, that the revolution would free the poor and strip power from the corrupt. He had believed it fervently. But what he had witnessed was not justice. It was vengeance. Vengeance wearing the mask of righteousness. After a long moment, he whispered a promise to no one in particular. "I will remember her. Not as a queen, not as a martyr, but as a woman whose final grace revealed the truth of her humanity." And though he did not know it, he was not alone. In that fractured city, dozens, perhaps hundreds, walked away from the square with uneasy hearts, carried with them a new, unspoken fear. If a queen could die this way, anyone could. The revolution had crossed a line, and Paris felt the tremor of the darkness that followed. The days following Marie Antoinette's execution unfolded like a fevered dream, thick with tension and uncertainty. Paris buzzed with strained energy, as though the city itself had swallowed something too large, too violent to digest. The revolution continued its relentless march, but something subtle had shifted. An invisible, unsettling tremor beneath the cobblestones and within the hearts of its people. For the Queen's body, there was no ceremony, no final rite, no mourning procession, no carved stone to mark the life that had once commanded entire courts. She was buried in a simple, unmarked pit at the Madeleine Cemetery, tossed among countless other victims of the guillotine. Earth and lime covered the remains of a woman who had once been the embodiment of opulence. The grave diggers did not know her name. To them, she was another casualty of justice or vengeance or necessity, depending on who asked. Yet even without a monument, her death carved itself into the memory of a nation. In the days that followed, Etienne found himself drifting through Paris like a ghost. His duties continued at the prison, but his thoughts circled endlessly around the Queen's final moments. He had seen men die. He had seen brutality justified by survival, ideology, desperation. But he had never seen a life so publicly dismantled, so ceremoniously stripped of dignity, then paradoxically elevated in the instant of death. Late one evening, while sitting alone on a bench near the Seine, he found himself replaying the memory of her voice from the night before the execution. "Forgive them, Etienne, even if they cannot forgive me." The words gnawed at him. They softened edges he had once believed were sharp and immovable. They forced him to question everything he had accepted without hesitation. He looked across the river toward the hulking shape of the conciergerie. From this distance, the fortress looked like a beast sleeping, digesting the souls it had consumed. He wondered how many more would pass through its jaws before the revolution decided it had eaten enough. Etienne shivered. He did not know the answer. No one did. "Etienne." He turned to see Abbé Magnin approaching, his worn clerical robe whipping gently in the wind. The priest's face was lined with fatigue, but his eyes held a calm strength. "You've been absent from Mass," the priest said softly, sitting beside him without invitation. "I fear grief might be strangling your faith." "Not grief," Etienne said, staring at the river. "Confusion." The priest folded his hands. "The death of a queen is a heavy thing, even for those who hated her." Etienne nodded slowly. "It was not supposed to be like this. I believe we were building a better world." Abbé Magnin sighed. "Revolutions are fire. They illuminate, but they also burn. The danger lies in believing the flame chooses only its enemies." Etienne bit his lip. "Do you think she deserved it?" Silence lingered. The priest took a long breath. "I think," he said gently, "that she was a flawed woman in a collapsing world. Not a monster, not a saint, just a human being caught in the jaws of history. And history is rarely kind to those it uses." Etienne felt something loosen in his chest, like a knot untangling. "Her death, it felt wrong," he whispered. "All of it." "Because it was not justice," the priest replied. "It was fear masquerading as righteousness. When a society chooses blood to cleanse its wounds, it often finds a stain spreads instead." Etienne lowered his gaze. The truth weighed heavily, but it was a truth he needed. "What should I do?" he asked quietly. Abbé Magnin placed a hand on his shoulder. "Remember her. Tell her story truthfully when others twist it. And guard your own soul, Etienne. The blade that took her will not stop with her. The revolution devours its own." Etienne looked up sharply. The priest's expression darkened, as though he had glimpsed a storm approaching. Across the city, other tremors shook the foundations of revolutionary fervor. A merchant who had cheered the Queen's death woke in the night screaming, haunted by the memory of her face in the basket. A washerwoman who had mocked Marie in the streets now found herself unable to speak when asked about the execution. Her voice cracked, as though some deeper part of her recoiled. A journalist, one of the many who had fed the frenzy with venomous articles, paused before writing his next column. His ink stained the page, but his conviction faltered. The blade's fall had not satiated the hunger of the angry masses. It had sharpened it. In the National Convention, even deputies who despised the monarchy now whispered uneasily, if a queen could be executed with such haste, what protection remained for any man or woman whose opinions diverged even slightly from the ruling faction? Fear seeped into political debates. Accusations rose like smoke. And in that atmosphere, the reign of terror tightened its grip. Marie Antoinette had been one of its earliest high-profile victims. But she would not be the last. Months later, as France plunged deeper into chaos, Etienne sat quietly in his modest room, writing by candlelight. He had begun keeping a journal, not of the revolution's triumphs, but of its cracks, its cruelty, its moments of humanity, its failures to recognize suffering even as it claimed to end it. And tonight, he wrote a story he had long avoided. He wrote of a queen in a dark cell, a trembling voice filled with sorrow, not arrogance, a whispered apology on a scaffold soaked with blood, a woman reduced to a symbol, stripped of everything but her final dignity. As he finished, he whispered a vow. Let the world remember the truth. Her death must mean something. He closed the journal. The candle flickered. Outside, Paris rumbled with unrest once more. But Etienne had found his clarity. The moral that history refused to teach gently was now clear to him, as sharp as the blade that had ended her life. When a society forgets the humanity of its enemies, it loses its own. And when justice becomes vengeance, even victories become scars. Marie Antoinette's final legacy was not the crown she had worn, nor the empire she had failed to save. It was a warning her death carved into the soul of France. Blood may silence a voice, but it cannot silence truth. And truth eventually demands to be heard. In time it would be, and her story, tragic, flawed, human, would echo far beyond the square where a queen's head once fell, forever